Rajiv, welcome to the session to have a dialogue on the experience that you had in the birth of Dunia. Uh, on 15th of September 2008, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. That was 2 weeks before the launch of Dunia. What went through your mind when you read this news? Just take us back to that time in your life.
Venkat, thanks very much for having me here. I guess you've taken me back in time to remember a moment that I still remember very vividly. It was a combination of emotions. To be very honest, we had put in 21, 22 months of work by then. We were very excited about an impending launch. We had worked extremely hard on a bunch of assumptions, and we had a certain mission and a certain fire within ourselves to go out and create a difference. We were getting into a very competitive market. And when I heard this news, I have to say it was a bit of a shock and awe kind of a feeling, because in some ways we weren't prepared for it. In some ways we had gone through very dizzy times in the world, and we thought we would ride the wave as well. I was personally to some extent I was extremely concerned, but not so much about what we were going to do. I was more concerned about the people who I had hired. I had hired people who had come in with a fair bit of conviction, people who had left very promising careers, people who had a sense of excitement about what they wanted to do, and suddenly the world seemed like it was crumbling.
Right.
So I think my concern was extremely high. The other emotion that I very strongly felt was a very strong sense of responsibility. And I think that responsibility came across several areas. One, of course, was to the employees and colleagues that I'd hired.
Right.
It was also to our stakeholders, to our shareholders who had put in so much faith. A lot of money had been invested. And I think in general to myself. I felt responsible because here was the real test, which I think I was going to face as an individual, as a professional, to be able to show that despite headwinds, one can go out and try and do things. So I was very determined as well. So I think it was a combination of shock and awe, a fair bit of responsibility, fair bit of concern, and I guess huge responsibility and strong determination. I think it strengthened my determination to do this better.
Looking back, what would you have done differently? And here we're talking about visioning, planning, and launching Dunia.
Well, if you go back and dissect anything in time, there are several things that one feels one could do different. And that's the strength of history. You can always go back and try and rewrite history, but you can't recreate it. But if I'm very honest to myself, and I'm very honest to what happened, I really don't think I would have done very different things, even if I had known what was going to happen in the world. And I'll tell you the reason why I say that. I'm not being arrogant here, but the reason I say that was that when we were planning to create Dunia and enter a market which already had about 50 plus institutions in the banking space, a small population of 5 to 6 million people, and a feeling of being heavily overbanked and a terrible amount of perceived competition, my team, when we sat together and we spent endless hours, we used to be in the war room as we were planning out our proposition. We were trying to work out how we would make a difference. Our room used to look like a true war room. We had more charts and paperwork hanging around, and we used to be redesigning things and deciding how we would create a value proposition that would make a difference. We fundamentally hit upon a few very basic rules. And one of those rules were that we wanted to focus on the client. Our own assumptions, and these were again in the boom times based on our own experiences, our own assumptions were that the market was somehow moving to more and more of a product focus. It was forgetting that individuals were individuals. Basics were being forgotten. So our fundamental premise as we were coming in to fill a position, which would have been more of a competitive position in the marketplace, in some ways we were going to take other people's share, in some ways we were going to create a new category. I think we created a proposition that was almost right for what really happened. In some ways, it was very difficult for people to accept it when the good times were happening. Why a proposition like ours, which sounded very simple, but it was very tough to execute. It sounded like something every bank claimed they did, but in some ways they were not prepared for it. Why it would succeed. And I think what really happened thereafter in September 2008, in some ways validated our own approach. So if I really wind back and go back and see and try and respond to your question, my sense is I would not do things very differently. In fact, if anything, this crisis and strategy that we had rolled out before validates that it pays to worry for the customer. It pays to care about the customer. It pays to be customer centric. And I don't think customer centricity is just a cliche term. I think customer centricity has got to be a theme in what you do. So even as we get out of the crisis, even as we get into better times in the future, I think there's one basic element we should never forget. We are in the business of serving people. And our mission in any business, in any service, in anything that you do, which is in the process of providing services to individuals, you should never forget that the end user is a human being. And a human being is a complex person. There are several decision processes that go on in a person's mind, and there are certain emotions that are very core to it, whether it's the Maslow's hygiene factors or the motivators. But you cannot ever hit out at the hygiene factors, because hygiene factors are basic. And in some ways, money comes somewhere in that region. And the fear of losing money is a reality. And while the greed for earning money is always a bit of a concern or a bit of a desire for people in a perceived sense, but the moment people start losing it, people tend to get concerned. So our whole approach of caring for the customer, putting the focus around the customer, making sure that we wouldn't go through any excesses, not follow a product focus, was part of our vision. That was our center line. We wanted to be the best for the customer. And the best meant, to be honest, to be fair, to be right, to enable the customer, to empower him, and to enrich his life. And I think we were true to it. So I wouldn't change the vision. I think it validated the vision.
If you could reset the clock to the end of September 2008, would you change any of the go-to strategies, HR strategies, any one thing?
One of the fundamental elements that we faced in our planning process was that having been a banker for more than 20 years at that time, and many of us who were very seasoned as well and having worked in several geographies, we were very clear that a crisis would come. Now, we cannot claim to know that this particular crisis would come, but we knew that in any banking situation, and I've lived in crises before, I think banking on financial services businesses go through a typical cycle at least once every 5 to 6 years. And crisis is old, decades, centuries old. There's always been some crisis or the other. You cannot wish away crisis.
True.
But it's just that a crisis of this magnitude doesn't happen that often. So if I look back, I think we were not without a plan to handle crisis. We had actually managed a strategy that would take care of a crisis. I think where we got caught out was that we didn't know that we would launch in the midst of a crisis, or the onset of the crisis. So I guess in a go-to sense, while I wouldn't have changed the fundamental proposition, because our core proposition, our core planning was actually just right for something like that. We were going to be focusing on the basics. We were going to be focusing on the customer. We were going to be focusing with a proposition that was highly automated, highly analytics-driven, with a sense of business intelligence built in at a customer analytics capability, process-enabled, workflow-enabled. So it had all the right smarts to it. But what I would do slightly differently, I guess, when it comes to go-to strategies, what I perhaps underestimated was the impact the crisis could have on people. A lot of my focus went on figuring out and understanding the customer and focusing on my employees, which I think are the two assets that any business has. The two fundamental assets are really your customer and your employees, because they really determine the success of your company. And I really focused hard on them. I think as a team, we focused very hard on them. So that I wouldn't change. And that really helped us come out of it. But what perhaps I would change is that a business has several other stakeholders. It has your shareholders, it has regulators, it has press, it has social groups, it has many other people who are watching you when you do business, and especially when you're a new player. I would perhaps, if I was to go back in time, I would communicate far more with other stakeholders, because they play a very fundamental role. Your bankers, your investors, people who are watching you from afar, and who tend to brush you at that time for the right reasons with other institutions that may have gone through. So when you're dealing with doubts, when you're dealing with concerns, when you're dealing with turbulence in the environment, you also tend to get brushed the same way. And I think over-communication helps. A second element was that while we had an initial set of people who had joined us, they were extremely trusting, despite the fact that they had come in good times. But they were by then very impassioned by the fact that they were going to get into a journey of this nature. So they were all very excited. None of them felt fear. They were not concerned. In fact, they were more determined that they would do better. But after September 2008, in the first few months, we also did hire many more people, because as we were growing, we started hiring more and more people to start serving the front end, to start serving some of the offices, and we got into a process of rapid hiring. I guess we underestimated the impact on some of these people, because even though the crisis did start in September 2008, I think the realization of crisis comes with a lag, and people tend to believe that the crisis will go away. And I remember making a very interesting presentation when I started seeing a few people break down in office. And that can be very distressing, because people are sometimes, not because they were working with us, but because people heard distressing news about careers, about people losing jobs,
Their friends.
assets crumbling, their friends losing jobs, their family members, in some cases, their spouses losing jobs, people being very fearful of whether they could continue to stay on in the UAE. So I saw a lot of distress creeping back into the work environment. There were questions being asked by some of our stakeholders whether it really made sense for us to continue to invest the way we did. I actually went back and spoke to most of them and assured them that what we were doing would perhaps be a winning strategy, and which only time could prove. So I think getting people to be with you and to be able to trust you at a time when every other institution, however trusted, went through a lot of stress, was something that I wish I would have handled far more closely. I'm not sure how effective I would be, because remember, if you went back to that time when everything is crumbling around you, if you're in an airplane and everything is shaking, if the pilot just calls you up and says, listen, I think you're going to be okay, it's very hard for the people sitting within it to really sit back and believe you. But I do say that whenever I go through turbulence, every time the pilot speaks to you, the first time he speaks to me, I get concerned, because it's got to be serious enough for the pilot to have told me something. But every time he keeps speaking to me, I feel reassured that he's still in the cabin and taking care of it. So I think communication helps. How you communicate helps. And I would do a lot more of it. Communication, communication, communication to all stakeholders. It really, really helps. It made a difference.
Right. Rajeev, in our earlier discussion, you had said that you had put up a slogan on the wall,
Yes.
which said that in the office, unlearn everything you have learned, right? You hired 300 people, mostly from global and regional financial institutions, and they had significant industry experience. Still, you wanted them to unlearn what they had learned. Did you feel that their knowledge, whatever they had done it in these institutions, would not be relevant to dunia, or what was the message there?
That's a very interesting question. Actually, I started smiling when you said that. Yes, I used to say that, and the line was very clear. I used to say two lines whenever I hired a person, and one was when we were working. The line that you're referring to about unlearning whatever you've learned was a line we used to use every day, perhaps 100 times in a day when we were working in the war room.
Yeah.
And of course, when I hired people, I used to tell them that my final line, if I selected someone, was, welcome, let's create history. And the reason I said, be a part of us and remember, unlearn everything that you've learned, it was more of a creative license, I'll be very honest. I certainly did not want people to go back and clean up the memory drives and suddenly forget all the skills,
True.
because we were hiring them for the skills.
Right.
I had taken a great amount of care to hire people from across the world, people with a proven and seasoned background. I was very clear that I did not want to hire anything other than a very, very talented, highly capable, and a very entrepreneurial set of people. It was, there are very many people who are extremely extremely good at their functions, but not very entrepreneurial. So I needed diversity, I needed focus, I needed energy, I needed passion, I needed creativity, I needed innovation, I needed a lot of ability to execute, so that's where the track record came in, and a huge amount of integrity. So to me, it was very clear that these skills were important. And thereafter, of course, I needed a strong sense of business and technical proficiency. So I certainly did not want them to lose their skills. So while I think everyone remembers the line that I used to use about unlearn what you know, I used to always add another, a TNC to it and say, please don't forget your skills, because that's what we hired you for. I think the issue was a cliche term. We wanted to do, we didn't want to do different things. We just wanted to do things differently. So what I wanted people to do was to get in their skills, but certainly not get caught up with their past experiences and past way of implementing things.
Right. Procedures and processes of the old kind.
Processes, or a belief that my former institution did it like that, so I must do it like that.
Right,
because then
right.
we would be a goulash
Right.
of a lot of an accumulation of other things.
Fair enough. I mean, you are looking at a different market segment, so they need to course correct that, right?
And
in
more
their
than that,
way of doing things.
More than that, when you set up an institution or when you set up a new company or a new brand, you try to create a new culture.
Absolutely.
And what we didn't want was a combination of old cultures.
Mm.
So I was very clear. What I meant was, forget what you've done in the past and how you've done it. Forget the how. Remember how you did it, but forget the fact that you can't do it differently. But what is more important is, let's find out the dunia way of doing things, in which the customer is at the core. Because most people had come from institutions which had the product at the core. And so that was a little difference. And I feel there are three kinds of skills. There are business skills, which are really technical skills. They're human skills. I certainly didn't want them to forget the technical skills. I didn't want them to forget the people skills, because in any situation, people skills are important. But the skills I wanted them to redevelop, which was in line with our credo, was really the conceptual skills. How do you put these combinations of technical and human skills into creating a proposition that people are willing to pay for? And I use that as an example of creating capital by using skills and knowledge to create value that people are willing to pay for. Otherwise, it's just theory. So I think it was a bit of creative license. It was also to bind people together. It was to give people the freedom that the culture, the credo will be evolved by all of us together. We are now several years into the business, about our fourth year, a full year operation. And I still don't think we have a rigid culture. I think it would be very silly of us to try and assume that by now we have a firm culture. I think cultures take a long time to build, and in some ways we have the flexibility to continue to do it. So I still say to people, unlearn what you've learned and keep evolving, because I think it's too early for us to cement ourselves into something rigid, because the world is still changing. I think if we are not flexible, if we are not creative, then we won't do justice to our journey. The journey's just begun. I think an important milestone has been achieved with profitability,
Right.
but our aspirations are far bigger.
So, creative license, freedom, and flexibility is a lovely note to end this discussion. Rajeev, thanks a lot for joining us for this discussion and giving your insights on the case. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.